Well, welcome everyone, and I know it's been a long day, and so in the spirit of Andrew Pudua, we're not going to give a talk. We want to just sort of invite you to listen in on a conversation. The plenary panel that we're having this evening is called An Evening with the Integrated Humanities. That's actually Megan's term. Has anybody received an email from Megan Fasaro? So whatever Megan says, we do. But I'm joined on our podium here, our stage, by Archbishop Paul Coakley and three lifelong educators and classroom teachers, Alan Hicks, Tom Foster, and Howard Clark. Alan Hicks was the founding headmaster of Gregory the Great Academy, an all-boys high school in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's taught at the elementary, high school, and college level, and was principal of a K-8 diocesan elementary school in Oceanside, California, in the Diocese of San Diego for 10 years. Alan is currently assistant professor of English and Humanities at our diocesan college seminary in Seward, Nebraska, St. Gregory the Great Seminary. Mr. Howard Clark, on the end, was the second headmaster at Gregory the Great Academy in Scranton and has taught at the middle school and high school level his whole career. His last teaching position before he retired a few years ago was at Blessed Sacrament School in Wichita, Kansas, where I served as pastor for a number of years, where he taught middle school English. Mr. Tom Foster, sitting next to Mr. Clark, earned his PhD under Dennis Quinn, professor of English and co-founder of the Integrated Humanities program at the University of Kansas. Tom has taught in the public school sector his whole career, both at the high school and college level in Kansas and in California. He retired in educational administration in California in the public schools and got out of California and moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where he now lives with his wife. Archbishop Coakley needs no introduction. He's my oldest and closest friend. We played baseball together on the same Little League team in the 7th grade. My dad was the coach. We went to the same high school. We were roommates all 4 years in college. Archbishop Coakley, like me, was a priest of the Diocese of Wichita and was named Bishop of Salina, Kansas in 2004 and has served as the Metropolitan Archbishop of Oklahoma City since 2011. But what binds all five of us together, this merry band of friends, again, Megan's words, is the fact that we were all students of the Integrated Humanities program at the University of Kansas as young undergraduates in the 1970s. We were also roommates with each other at one time or another during our college years, and 4 out of the 5 of us converted to the Catholic Church during our undergraduate years at the University of Kansas. I think I can speak for each one of us when I say that next to the power of supernatural grace, it was the liberal arts, great books, education that converted us to the Catholic Church. And we were not alone. Through the IHP, there were over 300 conversions to the Catholic Church over a span of about 15 years. And all this took place on the campus of a very secular and very liberal state university. And there was no Catholic campus center at the time, only the local parish church. There's a wonderful campus center there now, the St. Lawrence Center. The Integrated Humanities program flourished in the 1970s and 1980s and was team taught by 3 remarkable and very gifted professors, Dennis Quinn, Frank Nellick, and John Sr. It was a 4-semester freshman-sophomore course. The first semester treated of the Greeks, the second semester the Romans, third semester Christian and medieval literature, and the fourth the modern era. The program was integrated because we studied literature, poetry, history, music, philosophy, theology, art, architecture, dance, and even stargazing, all through the lens of the three transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty. The IHP was unique in that it was much more than a survey course of the great books. The professor's preferred teaching method, or pedagogical style, if you will, was through the poetic mode of learning, what they like to call education by the muses. They appealed more to the imagination than to the reason, to the heart more than to the mind. To be sure, academic rigor was not lacking. They were influenced by the great books movement at Columbia University in New York City, where John Sr. went to undergraduate and studied under Mark Van Doren, St. John's in Annapolis, Maryland, and the University of Chicago, where the famous Mortimer Adler taught and was a guest lecturer for one of our sessions. The professors strove to hand on, in the words of Matthew Arnold, the best that's ever been thought and said, but always starting from the point of wonder. These professors believed, through decades of teaching university students, that a true education should engender, quote, a birth of the human spirit, an entry into a new world that excites interest because it is seen in the light of wonder, end of quote. It's Dennis Quinn. John Sr. described it this way, quote, wonder is the beginning of knowledge, that reverent fear that beauty strikes within us, end of quote. In fact, the idea of wonder was so pivotal to the program and so essential that the very motto of the program was Nascantur in admiratione, from that prolific author Anonymous. We don't know where that comes from, but it's Latin, the subjunctive, which is translated, let them be born in wonder. Nascantur in admiratione. And in wonder, we were reborn. For example, each lecture would begin with a song led by an older student. After about 5 to 10 minutes of singing, the lecture would begin. And these were in large lecture halls that held about 150 students in each class. The students were required to have their desks free and cleared, and they were forbidden to take notes. No one was allowed to raise their hand or ask questions during the 90-minute lecture. There would be ample time set aside in smaller group settings where the students could discuss the books with the professors. But at that 90-minute lecture on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they were simply asked to listen and to remember. The three professors would begin the conversation amongst themselves about the books they presumed we were reading. One of the professors would read a key passage for one or other of the books, and then the conversation would begin. One writer recently described these lectures, quote, as unscripted, freewheeling conversations about the timeless works of Western civilization, where old teachers conversed freely with each other, and the young students listened and learned. End of quote. So, in a humble attempt to demonstrate in a very small way what these lectures might have been like, we'd like to now begin a conversation, unscripted.
Well, before we begin this conversation, I'd like to say that, elaborate a little bit on what you said there. This choice of what Bishop Conley called the poetic mode was not just a mere predilection. It was a reasoned response to the professors to what they considered to be the pressing need of our time, the need to reestablish foundations, human and psychological foundations, to be more precise, which have been so sorely undermined by the modern world, and without which any attempt to restore right reason would be like building a house upon sand. To elucidate this to some extent, I'd like to read a passage from John Senior's The Restoration of Christian Culture,
which they have downstairs with 8-day books. Gotta put a plug in for 8th day.
So Senior says, if we are to restore an authentic Christian humanism in the wide sense of Christian culture, we shall have to think not just about fighting infanticide, sex education, and pornography, which are the front lines of secular humanism. By all means, fight them to death, but for the positive work of the restoration of culture, which lies wrecked in the wake of the humanist assault. We shall have to think about simpler, larger, elemental things, which, losing their original strength, gave access to the enemy in the first place. Elemental things, which are the foundation and principle of the superstructures we must rebuild. The elemental things. People sometimes ask us, or ask me, what was the Humanities program about? And the simplest answer to make is that it was about the elemental things. Those things which do not provide an answer to the many philosophical, moral, liturgical, or political problems of our time, but they provide the condition for that. Senior wrote this book, The Restoration of Christian Culture, because he believed that there was a need to restore the culture which enriches the human heart, in which the soil of the human heart, in which the seeds of truth can grow. And that reestablishment of culture is not something that can result from mere abstract, philosophical, or theological conceptions of the mind, however true they might be. But it requires this contact with the real, with God's creation, and with the imaginative arts of literature, art, music, and poetry. In other words, the arts of the muses. And as Socrates says in the Laws, all education must begin with Apollo and the muses. And another way to put this, and then I'll end here, is that man today suffers from a diseased imagination. And you can't cure a diseased imagination through the direct study of philosophy and theology, however true it might be. And in fact, as Senior would say, and this might be somewhat controversial, if you have a diseased imagination, you aren't really capable of studying philosophy and theology, at least adequately.
Is this on?
Yeah.
The professors would sometimes admit that what we were in at the University of Kansas was a remedial program. Which, initially I thought, well, I don't know if I like that much. But, on further consideration, that was really true. In other words, if things were ordered correctly in our schools, what we were getting really should have been done in your schools. It should have been done in the grade schools and continued in high school, but it wasn't being done at that time. So they accepted that problem. You know, that this is just the way it is. We have to address that to the best we can. But really, what a lot of you are doing, and I'm just making an assumption, but I think I'm correct, is that you're already doing these kinds of things that the children need. So they're simple things, but they're also profound things, because simple things are by their very nature profound.
I'm going to correct Bishop Conley on one thing.
No, you
Won't be
can't-
the first time.
Can't do that. Not in his diocese.
People, no. People were allowed to ask questions. Their questions weren't answered. And
That's true.
And they were asked to leave the room.
He's not kidding.
Especially Frank Nellick.
Right.
Well, he was the enforcer.
Right.
So I'm going to make a couple of statements for which I will not provide proof, nor will I tolerate alternate opinions. You know, this session is supposed to be about the Aeneid, which I hold in my hands. I'm sure you've all read it. And one point I'll make is that of all the books we read, this is the greatest. Another point I'll make is that the following quote I'm going to read is the most important. Here in this grove, a strange light met his eyes and calmed his fears. It's Aeneas. For the first time, Aeneas dared to hope. He had found some haven for all his hard straits, to trust in better days. For awaiting the queen beneath the great temple now, exploring its features one by one, amazed at it all, the city's splendor, the work of rival worker hands, and the vast scale of their labors. All at once, there it is, all at once, he sees spread out from the first to the last, the battles fought at Troy. The fame of the Trojan War was now known throughout the world. Atreus' sons and Priam, Achilles savage to both at once. Aeneas came to a halt. There it is, came to a halt. And he wept. Aeneas came to a halt and wept. Oh, Achates, he cried. Is there any place on earth not filled with our ordeals? There's Priam, look. Even here, merit will have its true reward. Even here, the world is a world of tears. Sunt lacrimae rerum. And the burdens of mortality touch the heart.
You know, Tom, it's possible these guys haven't done their reading.
That's why I read that for him, because Now when you get there to that passage and read it, you'll have that amazingly poetic experience of recognition of something unknown to you. The interesting thing I think about this passage, though, that there are tears and things, is that it addresses in a visually descriptive way, in a profound manner, with heroic figures, one of the elemental features of humanity. One of the things that binds us together as humans across the ages. Why read books that were written thousands of years ago? How could they possibly be relevant today to some kids that, you know what they're like, listening to rap music and looking at their screens and all that stuff? Well, the reason's right there. And not even hidden that well by it. It's right there because they are Telemachus. They are Aeneas. They are Dido. They are those people with the same elemental qualities. But in many cases, they aren't capable of really addressing them, of really speaking to them. Like Alan was reading that passage, because their imaginations have been corrupted. So the idea behind the Humanities program was, if we read this book and books like that, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and other books like that, the Song of Roland. One of my favorites, The Green Knight, that imaginations could once again be forged. Because if you try to explain to somebody, well, mortality is a universal condition, and let's reason that out. You know,
And you can do that. I mean, there's a theological explanation for the sufferings of the world, and that's very true and very profound.
The Lacrimae Rerum speak of the fall of humanity. That it's the fall, it's the human condition. So there are theological underpinnings for these principles and these realities, these experiences.
yeah. And I would maintain that you can't talk about eternity until you can understand mortality. That's the book.
Yeah, I mean, in order to understand literature, you have to have a certain basic experience, you know. So in one sense, you could say, well, experience comes before the literature. But on the other hand, it's reciprocal, the effect, because experience, you know, if you've had experience, and you've had an experience of suffering and sorrow and difficulties, and then you read this book, that gives you an understanding. You identify with it, you know. But on the other hand, if you read this book or books like this, which you participate in those experiences, you know, vicariously, and then it sensitizes the soul. It sensitizes you to the experiences of reality. It's reciprocal. The experiences enable you to better understand this poetry and this literature, but the poetry and the literature also help you to see what is in the experiences, you know, to see more deeply into the experience, you know.
And I would say that I would maintain that these great works of literature are great works, considered great works, identified throughout time as great works, because they not only do that, but they are rich in it.
They're rich in it. Oh, yeah. I don't want to get too personal, but a few years back, I had some major medical.
Go ahead.
Major medical.
We're all friends here, you know. Come on, Alan.
A major medical condition, and I was suffering, you know, some great pain and deprivation of all consolation, and I had this moment where I remembered this passage from the Aeneid, and it's where the women have fired the ships. Aeneas is taking the remnants of Troy on this divinely ordained journey to reestablish the Trojan people, which becomes the establishment of Rome. So it's this very profound theme, and they've been traveling for 7 years, and they've had all these difficulties, and they stop at this island, and the men are off engaged in these athletic games, and some of the women are, they're tired of this journey, and Juno sends her messenger Iris down to inspire them to burn the ships. Juno doesn't want the Trojans to come to Rome, because they're going to establish Rome, and Rome will eventually destroy Carthage, which is Juno's favorite city. So these women take these firebrands and they burn the ship. And Aeneas and the men see this, and they run down to the shore, and Aeneas prays to Jupiter, who sends a cloudburst, puts out the fire, but there's 4 or 5 of the ships that are beyond repair. And he's kind of in despair. He's almost in despair. He's gone through difficulty after difficulty after difficulty. And after all of this, it's like this is the last straw. And he doesn't know what to do. And then this friend of his comes to him, and he says, very simple, just this very simple, he says, "Sir, born of a goddess, all fortune can be mastered by endurance." It's just this simple statement, and I was having this great difficulty, and I thought of that passage, and I went back and I read that passage, and it gave me this inspiration, to deal with this. All fortune can be mastered by experience, and you learn this by seeing people master misfortune through experience, and this is and the experience of in this literature, in this poetry, and these things is a way of expanding your experience of these real things.
So Dennis Quinn, who doesn't get quite as much press as John Sr., unfortunately, used to say that, when we read these great books or we learn these poems, that even though you're young and they may not have the experience of what's being talked about, that later on those experiences will come. And then if you know these poems or if you know these stories, they give form to it. It becomes more intelligible. And I'm sure if any of you have been teaching for a while, you've had this experience of, I used to have kids memorize poetry all the time. And I've had so many come back and tell me, like, well, Mr. Clark, remember that time you had us learn, stopping by woods on a snowy evening? And I'd have to lie and say, oh yeah, I remember that, And I had this girl come up to me, and she was in her 40s at this point. I taught her in 8th grade. And she said, we were having marital problems. I had to work, and I was late to go to work, and I was driving too fast, and I hit a deer on the highway. And at that moment, I just thought, I can't go on. That's it, And she said, Mr. Clark, then I started thinking about that poem you taught me in 8th grade, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. She said, that kind of pulled me through. I want to thank you for that. And so there's a perfect example of, you've given them this gift, and then later on, life supplies the raw experience, and then all of a sudden they have a way to give it a form and to understand it and accept it in a certain way.
Yeah, it's like those things, the poems, these ideas, the books, they lie in wait.
Yeah.
Or, what might be really important to one student isn't to the other, to us, to you, to me. You just never know, and it's really odd how they'll come up in different contexts and so on. But I agree. I've got all kinds of stories just like that, and some of them are kind of funny.
I was at a small college, and we had a program of poetry memorization, and I had an older student who was like hired as an assistant to teach poetry to the younger students. And this was a little college in the country in Kansas. And we had a little barn way back behind the woods. And the boys had a project back there that they were raising pigs, bought some suckling pigs, and they were going to raise them, and then they were going to sell them, and they could keep the money, you know, just to give them that experience.
I just want to say, I've heard this story about 10 times. No, but I like it better every time I hear it. No, I do.
Yeah. Can you imagine living with this guy? Which I have, you know, and that's what his wife says. Well, anyway, so one of the poems that we were memorizing that he was teaching them, which is one of the greatest poems in the English language, but it's quite long. It's Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard. Thomas Gray. And it's a 18th century poem, late 18th century. And there's this passage in the poem that says, full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bare. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Gray's describing this churchyard, and he's looking at these graves, and he's reflecting on the lives of these people. It's a country churchyard, so it's not famous people, people who, it's just these unknown, country folk. And he's thinking about, the potentialities of these people and the lives that they had and the hopes and the dreams and the
Sunt lacrymae rerum.
Yes, and then he reaches this point. He says, there are full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bare. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. So this boy, this young man, one afternoon, he was back at the barn feeding the pigs, and probably, having a smoke or something, and just goofing around back there. He's about 20. And he realized he was going to be late for dinner if he didn't book it back to the campus. And there was a road going back to the barn, but he took a shortcut through the woods. And as he was running through the woods or hiking through the woods quickly, he looked down and he saw this little forest flower, those little flowers, and he thought, if I hadn't come through here, I would never have seen that, and nobody ever would. This beautiful little, and he was so excited because he remembered that passage from Gray's Elegy. He didn't go to dinner. He came to my office. I was getting ready to go, and he knocked on the door. He said, Mr. Hicks. And he told me this anecdote of running through the woods and seeing this flower. It's just like what Thomas Gray was saying.
That guy.
This was a boy who, when he came to the college, told me that the only book he had ever read cover to cover before coming to college was a biography of Jim Morrison of the Doors.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Was that Tony Meone?
It was Tony
that
Meone.
book.
And here he is, memorizing what many people consider the greatest poem of the English language.
I would maintain that young man knows more about that poem than any of the college professors of English American poetry that I've had. I mean, it's because the direct experience of the thing.
Yeah. Well, now that I can't stop here, thinking of Gray's Elegy. Back in the French and Indian Wars,
Alan's pretty old.
He's that old.
back in the French and Indian Wars, the English had been victorious for for a bit, and they had pushed the French all the way to Quebec. Quebec was under the leadership of the great Montcalm, and the young, dashing, heroic English general James Wolfe was leading, his army to try to conquer Quebec, and Quebec was on a bluff, and it was there were walls, and it was they couldn't penetrate, the defenses, and he conceived this plan to in the middle of the night to row up the St. Lawrence River and to this one spot where they could then disembark and climb up this steep area and come up on this plain outside of Quebec, hoping to draw the French out to battle. And they were under orders or strict secrecy. They muffled their oars, but Wolfe was in this boat with his officers, and he had a copy of Gray's Elegy. It hadn't been long published, and he read that to his officers, the whole thing, as they're rowing up this river for this major battle. And when he finished it, he said, "Gentlemen, I would rather have written that poem than take Quebec tomorrow." Isn't that great? And then he fought this battle on the plains of Abraham, and they were victorious, and both Wolfe and Montcalm were killed at that battle. But he said, "Gentlemen, I would rather have written that poem than take Quebec tomorrow."
I don't know why we're talking about Gray's Elegy, but since we're on that topic, see, this is a typical IHP lecture where you think you're going to talk about the Aeneid and you end up talking about Gray's Elegy, but that's the way it goes. We have a really dear friend of ours that was in our class that just died of cancer. Well, how many months has it been now? February. A wonderful, great guy. And I was talking to another friend of mine, and he told me, he said, "Well, I would." So our friend was living down near Clear Creek Monastery, and this other friend was driving down from Kansas City, Mark Coomer line, on a regular basis. And I said, "Oh, wow, that was really great, Mark. What did you do?" And he said, "Well, Phil just wanted me to read him poems and also scripture passages, but." He said, "We read a lot of poems." I said, "Well, what did Phil really want you to read?" And he said, "Gray's Elegy." And I thought, oh my gosh, it's a good preparation, I guess.
Yeah. Philip also liked to sing Stephen Foster songs that he used to sing to Alan and me working on the farm.
We would sing them together.
Yeah.
You ever hear his version of "What Can You Do with a Drunken Sailor"? It was really great lyrics.
Go ahead. Give it to us.
What can you do with a drunken sailor? What can you do with a drunken sailor? What can you do with a drunken sailor? Early in the morning, hooray, up she rises, hooray, up she rises, hooray, up she rises, early in the morning. And he had shave his belly with a rusty razor. That was a good one. Put him in a longboat till he's sober is one of the common verses for that. Put him in bed with the captain's daughter was always one of my favorites. And he had several more that he came up with them. He was great at coming up with those lyrics. Wow.
It was his classical education.
Well, as long as we're talking about Phil and his classical education, Phil was a Swedish farmer. His father was a Swedish farmer, and if you know these Swedish farmers from Kansas and
Republic County,
Nebraska, they're kind of slow talking, and not a dashing young man, from Overland Park like you guys, But just a very sincere, really, really good man, and really a good young man too. And he loved this poetry, and he memorized this poem by Andrew Marvell, To His Coy Mistress. If we had but world enough in time, this coyness mistress would be no crime, So he went back to Cortland, Kansas, one break, and he made a date with this girl from the hometown girl. This just simple small town girl. And he was coming back from the university, and he told me this afterwards. So he said, so I drove out to this place in the country, and we stopped. He said, and I recited all of To His Coy Mistress. And I said, what'd she do? And he said, she said, take me home.
I had
A good girl.
Smart girl.
That was the right thing to say.
Yeah, no, she had her head on straight.
Yeah.
I had a kind of
She didn't need to study all this poetry to know that.
kind of the opposite experience, because one of the things we did learn besides poetry were songs, and a lot of the songs were love songs in disguise. And I met this girl, and we used to go for walks in Lawrence, Kansas, where the university was, and I would sing these songs. And as all of you now can tell, because you have had experience of my singing prowess, it had to be, a riveting experience for her. But she ended up marrying me. And whenever I tell the story, these guys are all thinking, we thought she was intelligent.
Yeah.
But it's the power. It's the power of poems. I one time asked John Sr., why the poems? I mean, he got the great books. Why the poems? He said, it was an afterthought to some extent. We thought we needed to, appeal directly to the heart. And poetry has a remarkable ability, unlike a lecture, sometimes even unlike a book, to bypass reason and speak directly to the heart. And they wanted to make sure that we were inoculated against what they saw as popular music, and rightly so. Mm-hmm. So I had at my disposal a whole series of great poems songs that I didn't make up, that I didn't create, but I knew by heart.
We got about 5 minutes. I like to tell this story. The Integrated Humanities program started in 1971. That was the first semester. And Alan, you were in that first?
Those two guys were.
Yeah, you and Tom. And so Archbishop Coakley, myself, and Howard, we were 2 years later. And John Sr. Was close friends with Dr. Ronald MacArthur, who was the founding president of Thomas Aquinas College. And Dr. Sr. was at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and they would have these summer schools, and they would talk about education and the crisis of education, et cetera. And they've been teaching for decades already. And Dr. MacArthur would say, John, the problem with higher education is the crisis of reason. Students can't critically think. They need logic, they need, say, Thomas Aquinas, they need to be immersed in philosophy. And John Sr. would say, and I found the letters between the two of them because I had to give the commencement address at Thomas Aquinas a couple years ago. I was invited to give the commencement address, and so I told this story, a little bit controversial, by the way, if there are any TAC grads in here. And but it was a friendly controversy. And so John Sr. would come back to Dr. McCarthy and said, you know, Ron, I don't disagree with you. There is a crisis of reason. And there has to be a restoration of reason. But before we can have a restoration of reason, we have to have restoration of the imagination. The students don't have any poetry in their souls. They don't have any music. And like what Alan was saying at the beginning, you know, that's the first thing that needs to happen, is that the sacramental imagination, which is really what you all are all about. You're preparing the foundation, the elemental things. In fact, we didn't talk about Dr. Nellick. Every now and then, just the conversation would just kind of be going like this. All of a sudden, Nellick he chain smoked Camel non-filter cigarettes, and this is what you could smoke.
And so he'd flick his ashes in his cowboy boots.
He'd flick his, and everybody'd be watching him, and he'd flick his ashes, and he'd look, and everybody was deathly afraid of him because he carried a switchblade. He'd oftentimes take it out to clean his fingernails with the switchblade. And everybody just like watch him do that. He knew everybody was watching him do that, you know. But he'd be sitting around, he'd take a big drag, and there'd be a conversation, and he'd lean over and he'd go, "Rocks are hard, water's wet."
You don't understand,
And
do you?
They don't understand. We didn't. You know.
And I still don't.
But we knew better than to ask a question.
When we were just beginning in the introductory remarks that Bishop Conley gave, he mentioned that 4 of the 5 of us were converts to the Catholic faith during undergraduate years at the University of Kansas. I am the lone cradle Catholic in the. I am. My parents were special. Yes. No, but the fact is, for all of us, I think our experience at the IHP and the kind of education that we received fostered an openness to elemental things and bigger questions and ultimate questions that included questions of faith and an openness to that. For me, the experience of my years through the IHP and as a student of John Sr., Frank Nellick, and Dennis Quinn certainly brought about a transformation in my life, and ultimately was very instrumental in my own reversion, if you will, or deeper conversion to the Catholic faith that was given to me through my parents at baptism. But it was something that ultimately was very much a part of my vocational journey as well. But the one thing I was going to say about the elemental things, one of the things that the IHP highlighted for all of us, I think, was the importance of what we witnessed among our mentors, our teachers, our professors, and that was their friendship that they had with one another. That's what made, I think, in my estimation, their teaching and their witness so compelling, so effective, so authentic, so attractive to us as students, was a genuine friendship that they shared, and a love for for teaching, a love for the truth and beauty and goodness. All of those things. It really awakened wonder and a desire to learn, to know. And so I think friendship is something that is important for us to not lose sight of in terms of what it means to be effective in teaching, and as well, our friendship with one another, our friendship in the classroom. And I can give a good illustration of how that was effective in my life. And I'm the cradle Catholic. When I was a freshman at KU, I was 18 years old. I think it was our second semester. My parents had told me, as long as you live under this roof, our home in Overland Park, Kansas, you will get up and you'll go to Mass every Sunday. And I did that every Sunday. I'd go to Mass because I lived under their roof. But when I went to college, I was no longer under their roof. And so I had to make some decisions. And I didn't always make the right decision. But when I made the right decision and would get myself out of bed and go to Mass, one Sunday I ran into Alan and Howard at St. John's. They had gone to Mass, and they were upperclassmen. I was a freshman. I was kind of amazed at these guys that I had just begun to get to know 50 years ago and more. They were at church, and I said, what are they doing here? It was really that kind of piqued my interest, that these guys that I looked up to were taking their Catholic faith so seriously, a newfound Catholic faith, and I was taking mine very much for granted. And they invited me to go to Village Inn with them to have pancakes after Sunday Mass. And I said, boy, these upperclassmen are inviting me to go to breakfast, and I was feeling pretty important. So we go to the Village Inn, and we ordered our pancakes, and I put them on the table, and I was an 18-year-old college student, and I was famished, and I immediately began to dig into my flapjacks. And when suddenly I looked up and see that these two guys are making the sign of a cross right there in the Village Inn in front of everybody. And that was a small thing, but that was over 50 years ago, and I still remember it. It was their witness of their faith that they had recently discovered, embraced, and were bearing witness to in such a simple way. But that was the influence that friends can have with one another, the example that they give to one another. So, one of the things that I treasure most about my experience at the IHP were the friendships. Absolutely. We've known each other for over 50 years. Bishop Conley and I for over 60 years. So what a tremendous blessing that is, and what an important part of the dispositions that we can set up for teaching and learning and awakening wonder and appreciation of beauty, truth, and goodness.
So let me just close with this. I've kind of dissed philosophy a little bit, So let me close with a passage from Aristotle. Aristotle says in his Ethics that no man would choose all of the good things of the world and have no friends. No man would choose all the good things of the world and have no friends, which is his way of saying, of all the things in the world, friendship is the best. Thank you.
One last point. I got one last point. Because you beat me to, and this will be the last one. Because it fits in, really does. Okay. So I used to say that I read my way into the Catholic Church, and in a certain sense I did, because I began to read. I was like the guy that only read, the story of the Doors, Jim Morrison. But as I got older, I looked back and I said, I did have this intellectual conversion, but it really was the friendships. And I read somewhere in Newman. Newman was one of the books we read in the last semester. We read The Uses of Knowledge from the Idea of University. And somewhere in Newman, I don't know where it is, but somewhere in Newman says that next to the power of supernatural grace, which is the greatest power in the universe, the example of virtue in another person has the strongest influence on us. And when you think in your own lives, who have had the biggest influence? It's the goodness in another person shown to you that moves you, right? And ultimately it's Jesus Christ, but it's Christ in others that moves you. And it's that friendship that was forged during our young years in college that moved our hearts and changed our lives forever. Amen. Thank you.